Just a quick introduction. John's going to be talking about laminates and veneers today. Most of you know John, so I'm not going to go into a big introduction because quite a few of you have come back from previous talks. But John's been working in the industry for a number of decades now and knows an awful lot about furniture manufacture and design. So with no further ado, I'm going to hand it over to John now so that he can discuss a little bit more about laminates and veneers.
Number of decades, that feels really old. Okay, so thanks everyone for joining today. Interesting subject area, this laminates and veneers, because it's problematic because it's kind of not the real thing. We're talking about fake things, and for somebody who grew up with a kind of modernist design training, you know, it should be truth to materials. It should be what it looks to be. So there's a bit of an image problem, and there always has been. And if you look back, there's a very good exhibition on at the V&A a few years ago about plywood, which I didn't get to see, but I did read the catalogue. And this whole sort of image problem of plywood, which is made out of veneer, which is covered with something. I think if you look in the dictionary, veneering means to cover up. And similarly with laminate, so the original laminate was Formica, which is the brand that we still use. Formica comes from Formica, a replacement for mica, which is a natural product. So there has been an image problem with these products. There's another problem, I suppose, in terms of sustainability, which is that when you make a product which is veneered or laminated, you're making a composite. You're bonding together different materials, which is a no-no in terms of, generally in terms of sustainability, because you want to make for disassembly so that you can have a circular economy, so in the future you can reuse those materials as well. So a few negatives to start on. And up to now in my talks, I've mainly been talking about kind of solid materials. But the thing with veneering, which goes back thousands of years, is it actually came about through economy. So it's about using a smaller quantity of an expensive resource, and underneath that, the local, cheaper product. So there is a kind of sustainable rationale to it, and that still is the case. There are some materials that we use in substrates like chipboards and MDFs which are derived from a poor quality of timber which you couldn't use in other ways, but by bonding veneer to it, it gives it a quality that doesn't otherwise have. And also there are some beautiful timbers that you wouldn't be able to make a product out of that as a solid material, but it has its quality is in its decorative nature, so we can use it as a veneer. So it's a bit of a kind of balancing act there. Laminate, I'm going to mainly be talking about laminate, so veneers as in thin pieces of wood, typically about 0.5 millimeter thick, and laminates, which are come in their raw form like this. I mean, there's a huge variety of man-made surfacing materials. I'm going to sort of stick with the high-pressure laminate for this talk. In the case of laminates, these are really prized for their durability. So it's one of the first plastics, going right back 100 years, really, I imagine. And there's still lots of kind of 1950s post-war kitchens and cafes in London still around with original Formica, so it's prized for its durability. So does the long life excuse the relatively high carbon footprint in manufacture? Okay, so that's kind of a bit of a preamble. Another kind of interesting thing was I was going to, as with the other talks, illustrate this talk with things I found around the house, and I really struggled to find any veneered products in my house. I've got some musical instruments, and I was looking. Some of them I thought were veneered and weren't veneered, it's veneering has sort of fallen out of fashion, particularly for domestic furniture. However, in the contract world, it's still an absolute mainstay, and that's because you can do things with a veneer product that you can't do with solid, you can make very large, very stable surfaces, for example. As I sort of said in the promoting this talk, I think there's some of you watching as specifiers, this is a really key area, because you can make really big mistakes with specifying veneering and laminating, or if not a big mistake, you can make things more expensive than they need to be just by not understanding some key principles. So that's kind of going to be the core of this. I've got a little table in front of me which is veneers, laminates, kind of differences, and then I've got some common factors as well. I'm going to take you through that, and then I've got a specifiers checklist at the end, and that will get us to the 10 minutes. So first of all, veneers mean real wood. They're made in leaves. So if you go around a veneering store, it looks like there's loads of planks in there, but actually if you pick up the planks, they're flexible because they're lots of layers of very thin material. So whereas laminates are composites and they're made in sheets. So sheet sizes that laminates are made in are typically 3 meters by 1.2. Although the bigger sheets available, we use 3.6 by 1.5 sheets as well. But one of the main head scratches that we have as a manufacturer is getting the best yield from those sheets. So if you want something which is 1600 wide, which you often do because it's a standard desk width, then that tends to lead to quite a lot of waste in laminate. Veneer, on the other hand, there's very little waste because you use what you need and you can joint it very easily. It's very difficult to joint laminate, and if you need to have a joint, you've got to make some sort of feature of that joint. So on the positive side for veneer, it's real wood, it can be jointed, and a negative for laminate is it comes in sheets, it's a positive, but it can lead to a lot of waste. Veneer being real wood, it is repairable, so scratches can be taken out, it can be refinished, repaired, whereas laminate, super durable, but if it does get damaged, that damage is gonna stay there. In terms of veneer and specifying it, it's worth knowing so that the grain of the wood that you arrives on your tabletop looks like what you were expecting. It's worth just revisiting something I talked about in the first talk to do with the way that wood is cut up or converted, or in the case of veneer, peeled. And courtesy of Capital Crispins, the lovely veneering suppliers in London, they've sent me 3 pieces of birch here, birch is typically used to make plywood. We've got 3 kinds here. I've got quartered birch, and if you look at this, you'll see that the grain is very sort of parallel, and I've got a few cameras on the go here, so I'm just passing it around. Very straight and parallel, and that's because the veneer has been peeled. This is representing a log of wood. The veneer has been peeled coming from the centre of the piece of wood, like that. And then I've got one here which is crown cut. It's not the most amazing example. You can see you've got some close parallel lines on the outside, and then on the inside it's a much more sort of open shape. And that is because that piece of veneer has been peeled sort of across the crown, across the top like that. So you'd see that's where you've got closer grain here and wider grain in the middle. And then the final one is rotary cut, which is, and this is where this comes into its own, it's literally been peeled in a long piece like that. And obviously that's what they usually make plywood from, because it's brilliant at making like lots of big huge sheets of veneer. But that's why it's got a very sort of, sometimes actually you can see quite a lot of grain in this, but often in plywood you can't see any grain at all, and it's just because the peeling is following the annual rings around. So that's one thing you can specify. You can specify whether you want your veneer rotary cut or quartered. For joints, so wood all the way through, joins. Another thing about point of comparison is, of course, with veneer, because it's wood all the way through, you can sort of cut through it and you don't have any visible, don't have an edge to it. Whereas with laminates, because they've always got a backing which is made of resin impregnated paper, you've always got a black line which you're either going to want to cover up or somehow make a feature of. So that's comparison, and I've got a list of common features, which is that using these materials, they're very stable compared to using solid wood. There are huge ranges available, lots of different laminate companies, all of them have got hundreds of different designs, and equally with timbers, hundreds of species and lots of different ways of cutting them. But having said that, availability can be a problem, so you can be bamboozled by all this choice, but then when you specify it, you find out that actually that one isn't available in the size that you need or whatever. So you need to talk to your supplier early on to check that you can do what you want in the one that you want. Another common thing is that veneers have to be balanced. So if you're creating a product out of with veneer or with laminate, you have your laminate on the top, but you also need to have a similar product on the bottom. Otherwise, it's going to bow. But you can save money here, because if it's something that the bottom isn't going to be seen, then you can specify a balancing veneer or a balancing laminate rather than the same quality of laminate you put on the top, which is a good sort of money saving tip. Another thing that they have in common is they all need edging in some way. Running out of time yet again, but I've got some. I'd probably finish on edging, and then maybe some of the other things I was going to say will be picked up in the Q&A. But in fact, this is sorry, this has been quite sort of on vogue for a while. The idea of putting laminate onto ply. Because you've got the black edge of the laminate, which you can't avoid, but it's disguised in the lines of the ply. It's got a nice sort of truth about it. It's great for if you're going to pierce the product as well, because you're going to see part of the substrate there. So that's kind of quite fashionable, but it's a particular look. You can do the same thing with MDF, which is regarded as a bit of a low quality thing, but you do see that if the wood is staying very dark, like in pubs, for example, you see that quite a lot. If you perhaps you shape the MDF as well, so you see less of it. So that's not having a lip in. Well, you've got two. These are all examples of laminate, but the same follows for veneer. So this is some white laminate, and on this one, the piece of MDF underneath has been lipped with some ash before the laminate is then put on top and trimmed back, so you get that very sort of clean look. And obviously if that was veneer, it would be the closest thing to just looking like a piece of wood. And we use that on a number of products. We use that on the ISO table. Looks really good, really clean. However, it does have an edge of laminate. It is vulnerable to chipping, even though we always chamfer it, but some people worry about that. So an applied lipping is the alternative, which looks like this, and we use this on the flag table. And very durable product, and it's better for sort of for impact, but it's a different kind of look. And then of course you have your lots of different plastic lippings which you can have. These are sort of machine applied, so it's cheaper to do, matching or contrast. So don't forget you can go for contrast. I think as of looking at the time, I probably have to end there. I've done a fact sheet this week, so if anyone's interested, I can send that out, and I've got a few more things on my specifiers checklist, or we might pick some of those up in the Q&A. I think I better close there, though, because I'm being very strict about my timings.
Hi, right, so we've got a couple of questions. So one is, when you have your veneer and you've quarter cut it or you've rotary cut it, aside from the way that it looks, is there anything that is different between the performance and where you might use one over the other?
Veneer specifically, depending on how you use. Yes. Actually, I didn't talk about the way that. So one thing that's worth knowing about from a sort of, because it kind of costs you nothing, is that when you specify something that's made in veneer, you can control the way the veneer is placed on the board. And because I haven't found any examples in my home, I've got a book here which sort of says if you as I said, veneer comes in stacks from a log that's all been sliced up. So if you take two pieces of veneer off that stack, you could open them like that, or you could separate them like that. And if you do that, that's called book matching, and you can have an almost invisible. If it's a straight veneer, you almost can't see any join at all. Or you could use that to decorative effect, like on the back of a violin, where you've got that sort of thing. So I've got some diagrams of that in this lovely book, Ernest Joyce, Furniture Making. So you've got sort of book matched appearance, and then you've got a slip matched appearance. However, I've got a feeling I didn't really answer your question, which was more to do with, sorry Antonio, or the person who asked the question, was it to do with actual performance of the different cuts?
Yes. So aside from the look, is there a performance? No,
it's really about appearance. It's about appearances. It's shallow as that. And cost. There's a cost aspect to it as well.
And so we've got another question. So talking about the cost difference, Jemima has asked, is there a cost difference? And I'm assuming, Jemima, feel free to talk away, that is there a cost difference between veneer and laminate? Is that the question?
Well, perhaps I can talk about cost generally. So that's a really good question, because one thing that is often surprising to people is that depending on the size of the product, when we spend quite a lot of our time, don't we, Antonio, specifying tables of different shapes and sizes, and sometimes you do one in veneer and one in laminate, and whilst you'd expect the veneering to be more expensive, sometimes it works out cheaper, and it's because of the size and the materials used, how much waste there is, etc. So there are some surprising, generally speaking, you would expect a laminate product to be cheaper than a veneered product, but that isn't always the case. In terms of veneers themselves, the great thing about the veneer is, yes, of course, it does vary a lot in cost. And these are some samples that I was sent this week by Capital Crispins. There's so many. There's some really kind of wonderful exotic woods here. But if exotic isn't what you want, I mean, that one is quite nice because that's walnut, but it's a burr walnut. So if you were using solid walnut somewhere, then you might want to have a different texture and use something like that. But yeah, of course, there's a big cost difference, but the cost difference of the material is relatively small compared to the cost of, for a relatively small incremental cost, making a really big impact. So I don't know if that answers the question. It is unfortunately, much as a furniture manufacturer, we would like to have a price list which just shows all the different possible sizes and all the different materials. It is one of those things that we always need to check availability. We always need to look at the exact size you want, and it does vary. But as I say, it can be surprising. Sometimes veneering will work out cheaper.
And on edging as well, on lipping, is there a big difference between those as well when you're specifying? Yeah,
there is. So, and it comes down to whether it's done by hand or machine. So there's something called an edge banding machine where you feed boards through and an edging is applied. It's not necessarily a plastic edging, it can be a timber edging as well. And so if it's a square edge and and it can be done by machine. I'm not going to say a square board because we have got machines that will go around curves as well. Then there's a big jump from that to something which has to be hand done. So these veneers, these lippings have been hand applied. Sometimes this one hasn't been, but sometimes you might mite at the corners as well, and that adds a lot of cost. The other thing that you might want to do is you might want to have quite a thick lipping on here, which you wouldn't be able to see, and then machine the edge so it had a shape to it or a chamfer to it, and you're adding another process, so another cost there. In summary, as ever, sort of the cheaper things are the sort of square edged things, and the ABS, the plastic edgings, or the sort of 2mm, 3mm strip of wood applied to the edge, which can look good, but that can be done on a machine. something which is a bit thicker, which has got mitered corners, which has got shape to it, that's where the cost is gonna go up. Probably a final thing also, the sort of not having a lipping at all, but having a nice substrate, that always tends to work out roughly the same, because although the plywood is much more expensive than MDF, you haven't got the additional process of putting a lipping on. So it's, you know, it's relatively cost effective if you like that look. By the way, this one is the same, but the plywood has been has had some sort of liming to it to make it look whiter. Thanks, Jemima, for your question.
Okay, I think that's it. It's now 11:22, so I think that is all we have time for. Thank you very much, John.
Thanks, everyone. It's a big subject. Probably needed two sessions on this one. But if you've got any more questions, then do feel free to email me afterwards, or LinkedIn or whatever.
Yeah, and John's going to be back next week talking about what is in a chair. So different ways and constructions of chairs and how that affects the user's experience when they're sitting in them.
Yeah, particularly upholstery. What's underneath? Yeah. Yeah.
Yes, the inners of the chair, not the outer. So I'll send you all an email with a link to that. And thank you all very much for coming.
Have a good week. Bye. For a relatively small incremental cost, you know, making a really big impact. So I don't know if that answers the question. It is unfortunately, much as a furniture manufacturer, we would like to have a price list which just shows all the different possible sizes and all the different materials. It is one of those things that we always need to check availability. We always need to look at the exact size you want, and it does vary. But as I say, it can be surprising. Sometimes veneering will work out cheaper.
And on edging as well, on lipping, is there a big difference between those as well when you're specifying?
Yeah, there is. So, and it comes down to whether it's done by hand or machine. So there's something called an edge banding machine where you feed boards through and an edging is applied. It's not necessarily a plastic edging, it can be a timber edging as well. And so if it's a square edge and and it can be done by machine, I'm not going to say a square board because we have got machines that will go around curves as well, then there's a big jump from that to something which has to be hand done. So these veneers, these lippings have been hand applied. Sometimes this one hasn't been, but sometimes you might miter the corners as well, and that adds a lot of cost. The other thing that you might want to do is you might want to have quite a thick lipping on here, which you wouldn't be able to see, and then machine the edge so it had a shape to it or a chamfer to it, and you know you're adding another process, so another cost there. In summary, yeah, as ever, sort of the cheaper things are the sort of square edged things, and the ABS, the plastic edgings, or the sort of 2mm, 3mm strip of wood applied to the edge, you know, which can look good, but that can be done on a machine. Something which is a bit thicker, which has got mitered corners, which has got shape to it, that's where the cost is gonna go up. Probably a final thing also, the sort of not having a lipping at all, but having a nice substrate, that always tends to work out roughly the same, because although the plywood is much more expensive than MDF, you haven't got the additional process of putting a lipping on. So it's, you know, it's relatively cost effective if you like that look. By the way, this one is the same, but the plywood has had some sort of liming to it to make it look whiter. Thanks, Jemima, for your question.
Okay, I think that's it. It's now 11:22, so I think that is all we have time for. Thank you very much, John.
Thanks, everyone. It's a big subject. Probably needed two sessions on this one. But if you've got any more questions, then do feel free to email me afterwards, or LinkedIn or whatever.
Yeah, and John's going to be back next week talking about what is in a chair. So different ways and constructions of chairs and how that affects the user's experience when they're sitting in them.
Yeah, particularly upholstery. What's underneath? Yeah.
Yes, the inners of the chair, not the outer. So I'll send you all an email with a link to that. And thank you all very much for coming.
Have a good week. Bye.